The sky wasn't blue anymore. It had been hours ago, a vast and punishing expanse of it, the kind of blue that bleached the color from everything beneath. Now it was the color of rust and old blood, a churning, blinding wall of grit that had swallowed the horizon whole. The wind didn't howl. It screamed a high, thin sound that scoured the land and the soul with equal ferocity. May felt it in her teeth, a fine powder that ground together with every clenched jaw prayer. Her horse, a fine-boned mare named Juniper, fought against the gale, head-low breath coming in ragged, dusty snorts. The animal was better bred for sunny afternoons in a paddock than for the raw fury of an Arizona dust storm, just like her rider. May's dress, a deep green silk that had been the height of fashion in a city 1,000 miles and a lifetime away, was now a tattered, filth-caked rag. It whipped around her legs, the fabric stinging her skin like 1,000 tiny lashes. Her hat was long gone, surrendered to the storm gods miles back, and her hair, once meticulously pinned, was a wild, tangled mess caked with the red earth. She couldn't see more than 10 feet in any direction. The world had been reduced to this suffocating, roaring chaos. It was a different kind of storm than the one she had fled, but no less deadly. That one had been a tempest of quiet fury behind closed doors of whiskey-sour breath and the cold, hard press of jewels against skin that would later bruise. This one was honest at least. It wanted to kill you, and it didn't pretend otherwise. Juniper stumbled. It wasn't a dramatic fall, just a tired misstep on the ground she couldn't see. One foreleg buckled, and the weary animal went down with a grunt of exhaustion and surprise. May was thrown clear, her body too tired to even attempt a graceful landing. She hit the ground with a dull thud, the air forced from her lungs in a choked gasp. For a moment she just lay there, the world a dizzying, painful swirl. The side of her face was pressed into the sand, and the storm raged on, utterly indifferent to her plight. Pain flared in her left ankle, a hot, sharp protest that signaled a bad sprain, if not a break. The mare struggled back to her feet, shaking her head as if to clear it of the noise and dust. She stood, sides heaving, but she didn't run. She looked back at May, her dark eyes wide with fear and confusion. May tried to push herself up, but a wave of dizziness and a crushing exhaustion pinned her down. The canteen on her hip was empty. It had been since sunrise. Her throat felt like it was lined with sandpaper, and a black fuzz was creeping in at the edges of her vision. It was a strange and terrifying peace, this giving up. To just lie here and let the dust cover her, to become another secret buried by the desert. It would be an end. That's when she heard it. It wasn't the wind. It was a low, rhythmic sound, a soft thunder that was felt more than heard through the soles of her worn city boots. It grew steadily, a counter-rhythm to the storm's chaos. Through the swirling curtain of red dust, a shape began to form. At first it was just a darker mass in the gloom, a smudge of brown against brown. Then it resolved into dozens of points, the horned heads of longhorn cattle moving slowly, relentlessly, like a force of nature themselves. And behind them, a single rider. He was a silhouette, a man made of dust and shadow. He sat tall in the saddle, not fighting the storm, but enduring it, a part of the unforgiving landscape. As he drew closer, details emerged from the haze. A broad-brimmed hat pulled low, its brim caked with grit. A canvas duster, the color of the earth itself. The glint of a rifle in a worn leather scabbard. He rode a sturdy-looking buckskin that seemed as unbothered by the tempest as its rider. He didn't see her at first. His attention was on his herd, his gaze sweeping back and forth, keeping the cattle moving together. It was Juniper who got his attention. The mare let out a soft, nervous whinny, and the rider's head snapped in their direction. He reined his horse to a halt, his body tensing with the caution of a man who knew that anything out of the ordinary in this land was likely a threat. His hand rested lightly on the stock of his rifle. May knew this was her only chance. The last ember of her will to survive flared to life. She pushed herself up onto one elbow, the effort sending a fresh wave of pain through her ankle and a dizzying rush to her head. "Help!" The word was a dry, rasping croak, stolen by the wind almost as soon as it left her lips. The cowboy urged his horse forward, moving with a deliberate slowness that was more intimidating than any sudden rush. He circled her, his eyes missing nothing. He looked at her fallen form, at the expensive ruined dress, at the fine-boned mare that was clearly not a working ranch horse. His gaze was sharp and assessing, not unkind, but devoid of pity. It was the look of a man weighing a problem, calculating the risk. A well-dressed woman alone and unescorted in the middle of nowhere. That spelled trouble. It smelled of a trap, of a posse, of a rich husband or an angry father not far behind. He stopped his horse a few yards away and simply watched her for a long moment, his face unreadable beneath the shadow of his hat. The silence stretched on, broken only by the wind and the lowing of the cattle as they milled about, their progress stalled. "Please," May tried again, her voice a little stronger this time. "My horse, she fell. My ankle." The man Jesse Colt swung down from his saddle. He moved with an economy of motion, every step sure-footed and purposeful. He didn't approach her directly, First, his eyes scanned the swirling dust in every direction, searching for any sign of another rider. Seeing none, he walked not to May but to Juniper. He ran a practiced hand down the mare's legs, checking for injury, his touch firm but gentle. He spoke to the animal in a low, soothing murmur that May couldn't quite hear over the wind. The mare, who had been trembling, seemed to calm under his touch. Satisfied the horse was sound, he finally turned his attention to May. He crouched down not too close, his weather-beaten face etched with lines carved by sun and hardship. His eyes were a startlingly clear gray, the color of a winter sky, and they held a deep, unshakable stillness. He looked at her twisted ankle, at the swelling already beginning to puff up over the top of her delicate boot. Then his gaze flickered over her again, taking in the incongruous sight of her. "You're a long way from anywhere, ma'am," he said. His voice was a low baritone, rough, like worn leather. It wasn't a question. "I got lost," she said, the lie tasting like dust in her mouth. "This ain't the kind of place you get lost in," he countered, his eyes unwavering. "This is the kind of place you run to or run from." May flinched, but said nothing. She couldn't tell him the truth. The truth was a brand on her skin, a story of a gilded cage and a man whose love was a form of ownership. The truth would get this stranger killed, or worse, get her dragged back. So she held her tongue, her silence a confession in itself. She met his gaze, letting him see the desperation there, hoping it was enough. He saw it. He also saw the faint yellowing bruise peeking out from the collar of her dress, a shadow that didn't belong. He saw the frantic fear in her eyes, a fear that went deeper than just being stranded in a storm. He had seen that look before, in cornered animals and in men with a price on their heads. Jesse Colt was a man who preferred to keep to himself. He'd learned long ago that other people's troubles were like quicksand. The more you struggled to help, the faster you sank. But leaving her here, that was a line he couldn't cross. Leaving a person to the mercy of the desert, no matter their story, wasn't in him. It would be a kind of murder by inaction. He let out a slow breath, a small cloud of dust puffing from his lips. "Can you stand?" "I think so." He offered her a hand. His was calloused and hard, the grip strong and impersonal as he helped her to her feet. The moment her weight came down on her injured ankle, a sickening white-hot pain shot up her leg, and she cried out, collapsing against him. He caught her easily, his arm steadying her around the waist. She was lighter than he expected, fragile beneath the layers of her ruined dress. For a brief moment she was pressed against his solid frame, smelling the faint scent of dust, leather, and sweat, the scent of the very land that was trying to kill her. It was overwhelmingly real, a stark contrast to the perfumed, sterile world she had escaped. "Can't ride your own horse," he stated flatly. He looked at his own buckskin, then back at his herd. He couldn't abandon the cattle. This was his livelihood, the culmination of a long and dusty trail drive. He made his decision. "My camp's not far, a few miles east. You can ride with me. We'll tend to that ankle there." He didn't wait for her answer. With surprising ease, he lifted her and set her on his own saddle before swinging up behind her. The proximity was startling. Her back was pressed against his chest, his arms on either side of her as he took the reins. He was a wall of solid warmth against the chill of the wind. He clucked his tongue and the buckskin started forward, falling into its steady, ground-eating pace. Jesse whistled sharply, a long, piercing sound that cut through the wind, and the herd of longhorns began to move again, gathering into a trudging bovine river. He took Juniper's reins, leading the mare behind them. They rode in silence, swallowed by the storm. May was acutely aware of the man behind her, his breathing slow and even, the steady beat of his heart against her back. He said nothing, asked nothing. He had offered help, a ride to a forgotten place on the edge of the world, and that was all. For May, who had spent years drowning in questions, demands, and veiled threats, the silence was a strange and profound mercy. For the first time in a long time, she wasn't anyone's wife, anyone's property. She was just a woman on a horse being carried out of a storm by a quiet stranger. As the red world swirled around them, she leaned back slightly, allowing herself to be held, and for the first time in what felt like an eternity, she closed her eyes and let someone else take control. The transition from the storm to the homestead was so gradual it was almost imperceptible. The wind's scream softened to a mournful moan, and the blinding curtain of dust thinned, revealing the hard, stark lines of the land. They had ridden into a small, shallow valley, a crease in the earth that offered some meager protection from the full force of the gale. A cluster of buildings emerged from the gloom, a small, sturdy-looking cabin built of sun-bleached cottonwood logs, a lean-to stable, and a sprawling set of corrals, their fences looking like dark lines drawn against the brown earth. A lone windmill stood sentinel, its blades turning slowly, groaning in protest with each rotation. There was no sign of another living soul. The place felt less like a home and more like an outpost, a last stand against the wilderness. It was a place a man came to be forgotten. Jesse reined the buckskin to a halt in front of the cabin's narrow porch. He swung down from the saddle in one fluid motion, then reached up for her. "Easy now," he murmured, his hands finding her waist. He lifted her down as if she weighed nothing, his movements sure and steady. The moment her good foot touched the ground, she swayed, the exhaustion and pain rushing back in full force. He didn't let go, his grip firm on her arm, holding her upright until she found her balance. He led her to the porch, which consisted of a few rough-hewn planks set on stone piles. A single wooden rocking chair sat near the door, its paint peeled away by years of sun and wind. "Sit," he commanded, not unkindly. May sank onto the top step, the rough wood a welcome, solid presence beneath her. She watched as he efficiently unsaddled his horse and led it along with her mare Juniper into the stable. He moved with a quiet, practiced rhythm, a man who had performed these tasks 1,000 times. There was no wasted energy, no hesitation. He secured the animals, gave them water from a trough fed by the windmill, and threw down some hay. His world was one of simple, necessary actions. When he returned, the storm was already beginning to die, the wind sighing its last breaths. The air was thick with the smell of wet dust, a clean, earthy scent that was the perfume of the desert after a storm. He carried a small wooden box, which he set down beside her. He also held a bucket of water drawn fresh from the well. Without a word, he knelt in front of her. "Boots gotta come off," he said. May's breath hitched. Her boots were custom-made of soft kid leather, and they buttoned high up her calf. They were the last vestige of the woman she was supposed to be. To have this strange, silent man handle her so intimately was a terrifying prospect. Her entire life touch had been a transaction, a prelude to a demand or a punishment. She flinched instinctively as he reached for her leg. He stopped, his hands hovering in the air. His gray eyes met hers, and for a fleeting second she saw not suspicion or judgment but a quiet understanding. He seemed to see right through her, to the scared, cornered thing she was beneath the ruined silk dress. "I won't hurt you," he said, his voice low and even. It was a simple statement of fact, not a promise meant to soothe. He wasn't trying to calm her fears. He was just telling her how it was going to be. She gave a shaky, almost imperceptible nod. He took it as consent and set to work. His fingers were surprisingly deft as he undid the tiny buttons, his touch light and impersonal. He was as gentle as the task allowed, but when he had to ease the boot off over her swollen, throbbing ankle, she couldn't suppress a sharp cry of pain. A fine sheen of sweat broke out on her forehead, and she bit her lip hard to keep from crying out again. He worked in silence, his focus entirely on her injury. He took a clean rag from his box, dipped it in the cool water, and began to gently wash the grime away. When the ankle was clean, he examined it, his fingers probing lightly, his touch clinical. "It's a bad sprain," he announced. "Nothing broken, I don't think, but you'll need to stay off it." He took a strip of clean linen from the box and a small tin of foul-smelling salve. He rubbed the greasy ointment over the swelling and then began to wrap her ankle with a practiced efficiency that suggested he had tended to more than a few injuries in his time, perhaps even his own. When he was done, the bandage was snug and secure, the support immediate and comforting. Throughout the entire process, he never once looked at her face. His gaze remained fixed on his task. He didn't ask how it happened. He didn't ask where she was going or where she had come from. He didn't comment on her expensive dress or her soft hands, which were now scraped and dirty. He simply tended to the wound, the immediate and visible problem, and left the rest unspoken in the space between them. For May, this was a gift more precious than any jewel she had ever been given. It was the gift of anonymity, of being seen only as a person in need, not a story to be unraveled. When he finished, he stood up and tossed the dirty water out into the yard. "Stay put," he said, and disappeared inside the cabin. May was left alone on the porch as twilight began to bleed across the sky, painting the clouds in shades of purple and bruised orange. The air grew cooler, and she wrapped her arms around herself, shivering slightly. The sheer, bone-deep weariness she had been holding at bay for days finally washed over her in a great crushing wave. Her head felt heavy, her eyelids like lead weights. She leaned her head back against one of the rough wooden posts that supported the porch roof. "Just for a moment," she told herself. "Just for a moment, I'll close my eyes." She didn't know how long she was out, but she was woken by a touch on her shoulder. She started violently, her eyes flying open, her heart hammering against her ribs. Jesse stood over her, his silhouette dark against the lamplight spilling from the open cabin door. He held a thick woolen blanket in his other hand. "Figured you might be cold," he said, his voice still that same low rumble. He draped the blanket over her shoulders. It was heavy and smelled faintly of wood smoke and clean wool. I must have fallen asleep," she stammered, embarrassed. "You were tired," he said, as if it were the most obvious thing in the world. "Food's ready." He helped her limp inside. The cabin was one room, and it was as sparse and functional as the man himself. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, a cheerful fire crackling within, chasing away the desert chill. A narrow bed with a simple patchwork quilt was tucked into one corner. A rough-hewn table with 2 chairs stood in the center of the room. A few shelves on the wall held tins of food, a cast-iron skillet, and a coffee pot. There were no pictures, no books, no decorations. It was a place for sleeping and eating, a shelter, not a home. The smell of bacon and coffee filled the small space, and May realized she was ravenously hungry. On the table were 2 tin plates, each holding a pile of pinto beans, a few strips of crispy bacon, and a thick slice of cornbread. A pot of coffee steamed beside them. Jesse gestured for her to sit, and they ate. The silence returned, but it wasn't the tense, judgmental silence she was used to, the kind that preceded an outburst of anger from her husband. This was a comfortable silence, a shared quiet. The only sounds were the crackling of the fire, the scrape of their forks against the tin plates, and the distant, lonely cry of a coyote. Jesse ate with the same focused intent he did everything else. He wasn't ignoring her. He was simply eating his dinner. May ate slowly, savoring every mouthful. The food was simple, but it was the most delicious meal she had ever tasted. It was honest food meant to fill a man's belly and fuel him for a hard day's work. It was a kindness freely given. She watched him across the table, his face illuminated by the flickering firelight. He wasn't handsome in the way the men in her former life were. His face was too hard, too weathered. But there was a strength in his features, a deep-seated integrity in the steady set of his jaw and the quiet intensity of his gaze as he stared into the fire. He was a man who seemed to have no need for words, who let his actions speak for him. And his actions today had saved her life. When they were finished, he took her plate and his own, and washed them in a basin of water. He moved around the small cabin with a familiar, easy grace. This was his world, and he was completely at home in it. May stayed seated at the table, the warm blanket still wrapped around her shoulders, feeling like a ghost, a visitor from another world. She didn't belong here in this simple, honest place. She was a creature of lies and silk of secrets and fear. The question had been building in her since she'd woken up on his porch. The night was a temporary reprieve, a safe harbor in a storm. But morning would come, and with the morning decisions would have to be made. She had to know. She couldn't bear another night of uncertainty, of not knowing the terms of her existence. She cleared her throat, and the small sound seemed impossibly loud in the quiet room. Jesse turned from where he was stoking the fire, his gray eyes questioning. "Do you want me to leave in the morning?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. The question hung in the air between them, fragile and heavy. It was more than a question about logistics. It was a plea. Am I welcome? Am I a burden? Am I safe? Jesse looked at her for a long time, his expression unreadable. He seemed to be weighing her words and her in the balance. He looked at her bandaged ankle, at the exhaustion etched onto her face, at the fear that still lingered in her eyes like a shadow. The desert was still a dangerous place. A lone woman with a bad ankle wouldn't last a day. To send her away would be a death sentence, and they both knew it. He turned back to the fire, using a poker to nudge a log into place. Sparks danced up the chimney and disappeared into the night. "We'll talk about that in the morning," he said. And with those words, he gave her another gift. He didn't offer false reassurances. He didn't make promises he couldn't keep. He simply postponed the future. He gave her the night. He gave her permission to rest, to heal, to simply be without having to worry about what tomorrow would bring. For tonight she was safe. For tonight this house of no questions was her sanctuary. And for a woman who had been running for her life, tonight was enough. She nodded, a wave of profound relief washing over her, so potent it almost brought her to tears. She pulled the blanket tighter around her shoulders and watched the flames dance, grateful for the silence, for the simple meal, and for the man who had asked for nothing but had given her everything she needed. The morning broke clear and quiet. The storm had scrubbed the sky clean, leaving it a pale, delicate blue that deepened at its zenith. May awoke to the smell of brewing coffee and the soft, rhythmic crackle of a newly fed fire. She wasn't on the porch. Sometime during the night, Jesse must have moved her, for she was lying on a pallet of blankets near the hearth, the residual warmth of the stones seeping into her bones. The heavy wool blanket he had given her was tucked neatly around her shoulders. Her injured ankle, propped on a folded saddlebag, felt stiff and sore, but the sharp, fiery pain had subsided to a dull, manageable throb. Jesse was standing by the open cabin door, a tin mug of coffee in his hand, staring out at the new day. He seemed as much a part of the morning landscape as the mesas in the distance, a solitary figure etched against the vastness. He had already been outside. His boots were damp, and there was a freshness to him, the scent of morning air and hard work. He seemed to sense her stirring, turning his head to look at her. His expression was as placid and unreadable as ever. "Morning," he said. It was a simple statement, not an invitation to conversation. "Good morning," she replied, her voice husky with sleep. She felt a flush of embarrassment, conscious of her tangled hair and the state of her dress, which was even more rumpled after a night spent in it. He pushed the coffee pot closer to the fire with the toe of his boot. "Coffee's hot. There's bread on the table." He didn't fuss over her. He didn't ask how she slept or how her ankle felt. He simply stated the facts and then turned his attention back to the world outside his door, giving her the privacy to collect herself. May slowly, carefully sat up. The cabin was filled with a clean, cool light. On the table sat a half loaf of dark bread and a knife. She poured herself a mug of the strong black coffee, the bitterness of it a welcome jolt to her senses. The bread was dense and slightly sour, and she ate it gratefully, the simple food a balm to her frayed nerves. After their silent breakfast, Jesse pulled on a worn leather work glove. "Got chores to see to," he announced to the room at large, and then he was gone, leaving the door ajar. May was left alone in the quiet cabin. For a moment, she didn't know what to do. Her life for the past 5 years had been a carefully orchestrated routine of fittings, teas, and social calls. A life where her hands were meant to be soft, her opinions unheard, and her days filled with a beautiful, suffocating emptiness. She was an ornament, and ornaments had no function. But here in this starkly functional world, she felt a desperate, aching need to be useful. She couldn't bear the thought of sitting here a helpless burden while he worked. Using a stray piece of firewood as a makeshift crutch, she limped to the door. The air outside was cool and carried the scent of hay and livestock. Jesse was in the corral methodically checking the fences, his movements economical and sure. He moved like a man who was intimately familiar with the language of wood and wire and animal instinct. Watching him, May felt a pang of something she couldn't name. It was a longing for that kind of purpose, for a life stripped down to its essential, honest elements. Her gaze fell on the stable. An idea, timid at first, began to take root. She knew stables. Before the silk dresses and the cold stone mansion, there had been a different life. A life of early mornings, of the smell of manure and clean straw, of a father whose hands were as calloused as Jesse's. That life had been poor and hard, but it had been real. Her marriage to the mayor was meant to erase that past, to sand down her rough edges until she was smooth and polished and unrecognizable. He had hated any reminder that his wife had once known what it was to work. "Hands like yours were meant for holding champagne flutes, my dear, not reins," he would say, his voice a silken knife, as he ran a thumb over a callus she thought she had hidden. Driven by an impulse she didn't fully understand, an act of defiance against a man 1,000 miles away, May made her way slowly and painfully toward the stable. The light inside was dim, filtered through cracks in the wooden walls. Juniper and Jesse's buckskin stood peacefully in their stalls, munching on hay. The air was thick with their warm animal smell. In the corner stood a collection of tools, pitchforks, shovels, and a well-worn broom. She picked up the broom. The rough handle felt alien in her hands, which had grown soft and unaccustomed to labor. Her silk dress was hopelessly impractical, but she found a piece of twine and tied the skirt up around her knees, bunching the expensive fabric out of the way. She set to work, sweeping the aisle. Her movements were clumsy at first. Her ankle ached with every step, and her arms, unused to the strain, protested. But slowly, a rhythm returned. A muscle memory buried deep beneath years of forced inactivity began to stir. The rhythmic scrape of the broom on the hard-packed earth was a familiar, comforting sound from a life she thought had been lost forever. She was no longer Mrs. Alistair Finch, the mayor's beautiful barren wife. She was just May, a girl who knew how to muck out a stall. With each sweep of the broom, she felt as though she were clearing away more than just dust and straw. She was sweeping away the cloying perfume, the heavy silence, and the cold, gilded bars of her cage. Jesse entered the stable so quietly she didn't hear him until he was right behind her. "What do you think you're doing?" She whirled around, startled, nearly losing her balance. He stood there, his face unreadable, his eyes taking in the sight of her, the hitched-up dress, the sweat on her brow, the broom in her hand. She expected him to be angry, to tell her to go back inside, to stop meddling in his world. It was what Alistair would have done, his voice dripping with condescension. I wanted to help," she stammered, her grip tightening on the broom handle as if it were a weapon. Jesse looked at the section of the aisle she had swept. It was a neat, clean patch in the otherwise dusty floor. He looked at her hands, already red from the unaccustomed work. He looked at her face, flushed and determined. Then he simply grunted a non-committal sound deep in his chest. He walked past her to his buckskin stall and began to pitch fresh hay into the manger. He didn't tell her to stop, and in his world that was the same as giving her permission to continue. A silent partnership formed. He worked on one side of the stable, mending a piece of tack, his hands moving with practiced skill over the worn leather. She worked on the other, slowly, painstakingly cleaning the stalls. The work was hard, and her body, softened by years of leisure, screamed in protest. Her ankle was a constant throbbing misery, but she pushed on, fueled by a stubborn pride she had forgotten she possessed. As she reached up to unlatch a stall door, the sleeve of her dress, already torn at the seam, slipped down her arm, exposing her wrist. A dark, ugly bruise the color of a fading plum marred the pale skin. It was shaped vaguely like a man's thumb, and forefingers a mark of violent possession. Jesse saw it. He had been polishing a silver concho on a bridle, and his hands stilled for just a fraction of a second. His gaze locked onto the bruise, and something cold and hard flickered in his eyes. It was a look of grim recognition, the look of a man who understood the kind of casual cruelty that left such marks. May saw him looking and quickly pulled her sleeve back down her face, burning with a hot, terrible shame. She expected a question. How did that happen? Or worse, a look of pity. She braced herself for the unwanted attention, the inevitable prying that would force her to lie or to reveal the ugly truth. But Jesse said nothing. His gaze dropped back to the bridle in his lap, and he resumed polishing the concho, his movements as steady and deliberate as before. He did not ask. He did not comment. He simply saw the wound, acknowledged it in the silence, and let it be. His refusal to question her was a wall he built around her privacy, a quiet declaration that her past was her own. He was offering her a refuge not just from the desert, but from the judgment of the world. In that moment, May felt a wave of gratitude so intense it almost buckled her knees. Later, as the sun climbed higher, the stable grew warm. May, sweating and covered in dust, paused to tie her hair back from her face. She used the same piece of twine that held up her skirt. As she lifted her arms, the collar of her dress gaped open, revealing the side of her neck. There, just below her ear, was a thin silvery white line, an old scar long since healed but still visible against the smooth skin. It was a delicate, cruel-looking mark, as if a sharp edge had once been pressed there with great force. Jesse, who was now checking one of Juniper's hooves, saw this too. His eyes lingered on the scar for a moment longer than they had on the bruise. He saw the story the two marks told together. One was new, the result of a recent struggle, a desperate act of escape. The other was old, a testament to a pain that had been endured for a long time. They were the unseen wounds, the evidence of a private war she had been fighting long before she ever fell from her horse in his desert. His jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. He thought of the men he knew who were loud and cruel men who used their strength to break things, horses, other men, women. Men like the one who had clearly owned this woman. They were a breed he despised. He finished with the horse's hoof, giving the mare a gentle pat on the flank. He still said nothing. What was there to say? Words couldn't unmake a scar. They couldn't heal a bruise. All he could offer was this, a quiet place to work a silent understanding and the dignity of not being asked to explain her wounds to a stranger. When the stalls were clean, May was utterly spent. Her hands were raw, her ankle was on fire, and every muscle in her body ached. But it was a good ache. It was the ache of honest work, of having accomplished something real and tangible. She leaned against the stable wall, breathing heavily, watching as Jesse led the horses out to the corral for the day. He returned with a dipper of cool water from the trough. He offered it to her without a word. She took it, her hands trembling slightly, and drank deeply. The water was clean and cold and tasted of the deep earth. When she was done, she handed the dipper back to him. Their fingers brushed for a moment, his hard and calloused against her soft, blistered skin. It was a small, accidental touch, but it felt strangely significant. "Thank you," she said, her voice quiet. He just nodded, his eyes meeting hers for a moment. And in that look, a silent understanding passed between them. He knew she was a runaway. He knew she was in trouble. And she knew that he knew. And she knew that he wouldn't ask. He had seen her wounds, the visible and the invisible, and had chosen to offer her work and water instead of questions. For May, it was more than kindness. It was respect. The day bled into evening, and the harsh, bleached light of the Arizona sun softened into hues of gold and rose. The sky was a vast open canvas, and the silence that settled over the land was as profound as the roar of the storm had been. After another simple meal of stew and coffee, Jesse built a small fire in a ring of stones a few yards from the cabin. The flames pushed back the gathering dark and the encroaching chill of the desert night. May sat on a smooth log he had dragged over for her, her bandaged ankle propped on a smaller stone. She held a warm tin mug in her hands, though the coffee had long since gone cold. She was watching the fire, mesmerized by the way the flames danced and writhed, consuming the dry mesquite wood with a hungry crackle. The physical ache in her body from the day's labor was a dull, thrumming presence, a constant reminder of her new reality. It was an honest pain so different from the sharp, shameful ache of a bruise or the sting of a cruel word. Jesse sat across from her on the hard-packed earth, his back against a saddle. He was cleaning his rifle, his movements methodical and unhurried. The firelight glinted off the oiled steel and the dark-worn wood of the stock. He worked with a quiet focus, his hands sure and steady. He was a man comfortable in his own solitude, yet he had allowed her to intrude upon it without complaint. He had seen the evidence of her past etched onto her skin, and had chosen to look away to grant her the dignity of her secrets. That singular act of grace was a greater kindness than any she had ever known. In the world she had left behind, secrets were a currency, and a woman's reputation was a fragile, brittle thing. Every action, every word was weighed and judged. A whisper in the right ear could ruin a life. Her husband, Mayor Alistair Finch, had been the Chief Justice in the court of her life. He had delighted in pointing out her flaws, her missteps, her failures. He had catalogued her sins, the greatest of which in his eyes was her inability to give him a child. He had called her barren empty, a beautiful but useless vessel, and he had made sure she knew that any value she had was derived entirely from him, a value that could be revoked at his whim. To survive in his house had required a different kind of strength, the strength of endurance, of deception, of swallowing pride and pain, until they became a permanent bitter taste in the back of her throat. Her escape had not been clean. It had been a desperate, messy act of self-preservation. She had waited for him to leave on a trip to the capital. She had taken jewels he had given her, but that had felt more like gilded shackles than gifts. She had taken cash from his safe money she considered a long overdue payment for 5 years of her life. She had lied to the stable boy and had ridden away on her fine mare, dressed for an afternoon ride she never intended to complete. In the eyes of the law and in the eyes of any decent person, she was a thief. She had broken vows, both legal and sacred. She had done wrong. The question had been circling in her mind all day, a dark bird of prey. She had found a momentary sanctuary here, a place of quiet acceptance, but she felt like an imposter. This quiet, decent man had offered her shelter, had tended her wounds, and shared his food. What would he think of her if he knew the truth? Would the kindness in his eyes curdle into contempt? Would he see her not as a woman in need, but as a common criminal, a faithless wife? A creature deserving of whatever fate she had been running from. The fear of that judgment was a cold knot in her stomach. She had to know. She had to test the foundation of this fragile peace. The moon rose a perfect silver disk in a sky littered with a spray of cold, distant stars. The desert was bathed in its ethereal light. The landscape transformed into a world of silver and shadow. The only warmth was the fire, a small, vibrant island of orange and red in the vast, cool darkness. She took a deep breath, the dry, clean air filling her lungs. Her voice, when it came, was small, almost carried away by the night breeze. Jesse. He didn't look up from his work, but his hands stilled. "Ma'am?" She stared into the flames, unable to meet his eyes. If I ever did something wrong to survive," she began, the words catching in her throat, "something that other folks might look down on, would you despise me for it?" The question fell into the silence between them, heavy and profound. The only sound was the crackle of the fire and the far-off, lonely howl of a coyote. Jesse stopped his work entirely. He laid the rifle carefully across his lap. He didn't look at her. He looked into the fire, his expression thoughtful, his gaze distant. May's heart hammered against her ribs. She held her breath, bracing herself for the verdict. She expected a platitude, a lecture, or worst of all, a prying question. The silence stretched long and deep. He seemed to be weighing her question not as an accusation to be answered, but as a philosophical truth to be considered. He picked up a long, thin stick and poked at the embers, sending a shower of sparks up into the darkness. Finally, he spoke, his voice a low, gravelly rumble that seemed to come from the very earth he sat upon. "No one survives in this land," he said slowly, his eyes still fixed on the flames, "without doing something they're not proud of." He let the words hang in the air, simple, stark, and absolute. It wasn't an absolution. It wasn't forgiveness. It was a statement of fact, a fundamental law of this harsh and unforgiving country. It was an acknowledgement that survival was a messy, complicated business, and that morality was a luxury not always afforded to those living on the edge. In that single sentence, he dismantled the entire framework of judgment and condemnation that had imprisoned her for years. He didn't just answer her question. He told her that her question was one that everyone out here had to ask themselves eventually. And with the phrase, "no one," he included himself. He laid his own unseen wounds, his own unspoken secrets alongside hers. He was not a judge sitting on high. He was a fellow survivor. A breath she hadn't realized she was holding escaped her lips in a long, shaky sigh. The cold knot in her stomach didn't just loosen. It dissolved entirely, replaced by a surge of warmth that had nothing to do with the fire. It was the warmth of acceptance of being seen not as a collection of sins and secrets, but simply as a person who had done what was necessary. Tears pricked the back of her eyes, but she would not let them fall. Crying was a weakness her husband had enjoyed seeing. Here it felt unnecessary. She didn't tell him her story. She didn't have to. He had already told her it didn't matter. The trust that had been a tiny, fragile seed began to sprout. It was a trust born not of shared confessions, but of a shared understanding of the world's harshness. The log she was sitting on was long. There were a good 4 feet of space between them. Without thinking, without conscious decision, she shifted. She slid along the rough bark of the log, closing half the distance between them. It was a small movement, a quiet gesture that went unremarked. But it was an answer. It was a treaty. It was a step out of her own isolation and into the shared space he had created. She set her empty mug down beside her. Jesse picked up his rifle again, but he didn't resume cleaning it. He just held it, resting it across his knees. The silence that returned was different. The tension was gone. It was a deeper, more comfortable quiet now, the silence of 2 people who had reached an accord without signing a single paper. They sat like that for a long time, side by side, 2 solitary figures watching the fire burn down to glowing embers under the vast, silent, and watchful eye of the desert moon. The future was still an unknown territory, a blank and frightening map. But for the first time in a very long time, May felt that she might not have to cross it alone. The quiet days settled into a fragile routine, like a thin layer of dust coating the cabin's sparse furniture. Several sunrises came and went, each one a little less terrifying than the last for May. Her ankle began to heal the angry swelling, receding the pain, dulling to a persistent ache. She could move around the cabin and the yard now with the help of a sturdy walking stick Jesse had fashioned for her from a straight-limbed branch of ironwood. With this limited mobility came a renewed sense of purpose. She could not work in the stables, but she could make herself useful within the small sphere of the cabin. She took over the cooking, transforming Jesse's basic supplies of beans, bacon, and flour into savory stews and passable biscuits. She found a small sewing kit in his saddlebags, a few needles, a spool of thick dark thread, and set about mending his work shirts, her stitches small and neat, a skill learned during the long, silent afternoons in a life before this one. She swept the floor, washed the few dishes, and kept the fire fed. They were small tasks, but they were hers. They were her way of earning her keep, of transforming herself from a piece of helpless baggage into a part of this quiet 2-person world. Jesse accepted her contributions with the same silent gravity he did everything else. He never thanked her, but when he came in from a long day of riding the fence line, he would nod at the pot simmering over the fire, and a look of something akin to quiet appreciation would pass through his gray eyes. They rarely spoke of anything beyond the immediate and the necessary. Need more water from the well. That fence post by the south pasture is loose. More rain coming, I think. Their communication was a language of shared tasks and comfortable silences. For May, who had lived in a world where words were weapons, this quiet was the sound of peace. The future was still a terrifying, unspoken question, but for the first time she began to imagine that a life that wasn't defined by fear might be possible. One morning, Jesse announced he was riding into town. The settlement, which he called Blackwater Gap, was a half-day's ride away. One of the buckskin shoes was loose, and he was low on coffee and salt. He saddled his horse, his movements as economical as always. and tied a few empty canvas sacks behind his cantle. "I'll be back by sundown," he said. It was the longest sentence he'd strung together all week. May stood in the doorway, leaning on her stick. "Be careful," she said the words, feeling small and inadequate. He just touched the brim of his hat in acknowledgement and rode out, disappearing over the low rise to the east. The cabin and the valley felt profoundly empty in his absence. The silence, which had been a comfort when he was near, now felt vast and lonely. Blackwater Gap wasn't much of a town. It was a single wide, dusty street, squinting under the relentless sun, flanked by a dozen or so false-fronted buildings, a general store, a saloon with swinging doors that sighed with every push of the wind, a livery, and a blacksmith's shop, from which the rhythmic clang of a hammer on an anvil rang out like the town's slow, steady heartbeat. Jesse Colt was not a man who lingered in towns. He disliked the noise, the press of people, and the idle gossip that passed for currency. He tied his horse in front of the blacksmith's, his business, the only thing on his mind. But as he swung down from the saddle, he felt it, a change in the air. The usual lazy afternoon torpor of the town was gone, replaced by a low, humming tension. Men were gathered in small, tight knots on the boardwalk, their voices low and urgent. Their eyes kept flicking to a group of 5 newcomers whose horses were tied in front of the saloon. These were not local ranchers or prospectors. They were dressed in dark, well-made clothes, their boots polished, their gun belts new and oiled. They wore their pistols tied low, and they carried themselves with an air of cold, professional arrogance. They were strangers, and their presence had put the entire town on edge. Jesse ignored them and led his horse into the blacksmith's forge. The air inside was thick with the smell of coal smoke and hot iron. The blacksmith, a burly man named Peterson, with arms as thick as tree limbs, nodded a greeting. "Colt, that shoe again." "Came loose," Jesse confirmed, running a hand down the buckskin's leg. "Heard you had a bit of weather out your way," Peterson said, his hammer striking a glowing piece of iron, sending a shower of orange sparks into the gloom. "Some," Jesse said, his answers always clipped. 2 other ranchers were in the shop waiting their turn, and they were the ones who were talking. 5 of them. One was saying a lanky man named Abe. "Rode in this morning. Fella in charge, Harcourt he called himself, went straight to the sheriff's office. They're bounty men." "Bounty on who?" the other asked. Abe gestured with his chin toward the street. "They posted bills all over town. Some woman, a runaway wife from back east, they say." Jesse's body went still, a cold, heavy feeling settling in the pit of his stomach. He kept his back to the men, pretending to inspect a crack in his horse's hoof, but his hearing sharpened, catching every word. "Rich man's wife," Abe continued, his voice full of a grim sort of excitement. "Some big-shot mayor. Poster says she made off with a fortune in jewels." "That ain't the half of it." Peterson, the blacksmith, grunted, not missing a beat with his hammer. "The poster says she's wanted for murder, too. Killed a maid or some such before she fled. A real black widow, that one." Murder. The word hit Jesse like a physical blow. He thought of May, her quiet competence, the fear in her eyes, the gentle way she had patched his shirt. He thought of the bruises, and he thought of her question by the fire. "If I ever did something wrong to survive, would you despise me for it?" $500, Abe whistled. Gold coin, enough to make a man quit punching cows for good. Harcourt and his men were asking if anyone had seen a woman passing through alone, well dressed on a fine horse. Jesse's blood ran cold. He had seen that woman. She was sleeping in his cabin. He had eaten her cooking this morning. The world seemed to tilt on its axis. He felt a slow, cold anger begin to build inside him, an anger directed at the unseen mayor, at the arrogant men in the saloon, and at the cruel twist of fate that had led this storm to his front door. He kept his face a mask of indifference. He waited while Peterson fixed the shoe, his mind a whirlwind of calculations and gut feelings. He paid the man his movements stiff. As he left the forge, he walked past the wall of the general store, and there it was, a freshly printed bill tacked to the wood. The ink was stark and black. A drawing, poorly rendered but still recognizable, depicted a woman with high cheekbones and dark hair. The words were a death sentence. Wanted $500, a reward for information leading to the arrest of Maeve Elizabeth Finch, wife of the Honorable Mayor Alistair Finch, fugitive from justice. Wanted for theft of property and for questioning in the death of a household servant, considered desperate and not to be approached alone. Maeve, not May. The name was another layer of a life he knew nothing about. He stared at the poster, committing every word to memory. Questioning in the death. It was a careful legalistic phrase, but its meaning was clear. They had already convicted her. The powerful, unseen mayor had written her story, and it was a story of a beautiful, treacherous killer. Jesse looked from the paper to the men drinking in the saloon, their laughter audible from across the street. They were hunters, and their prey was the woman who had trusted him with her silence. He didn't believe it, not for a second. The woman described on that poster was not the woman who hummed softly to herself while she kneaded dough. The fear he had seen in her was not the fear of a killer facing justice. It was the fear of an animal fleeing a trap. He untied his horse, bought the salt and coffee in a blur, and rode out of Blackwater Gap without a backward glance. The ride home was different. The familiar landscape seemed menacing now, every shadow a potential hiding place, every gust of wind a whisper of the coming danger. The old wind, the one she had fled, had found her. It had a name now, Harcourt, and it carried the scent of money and death. His mind raced. What was he going to do? The safe, simple answer was to ride back to his cabin, tell her what he saw, and send her on her way. It wasn't his fight. He had offered her shelter from a storm, and he had done it. He owed her nothing more. To help her further was to invite a war with 5 professional gunmen and a powerful, wealthy man from a world he didn't understand. It was to risk everything: his ranch, his freedom, his life for a woman. He barely knew a woman whose real name he had just learned from a wanted poster. But then he thought of her face, the way the tension had eased from it when he answered her question by the fire. He had given her his unspoken word that this was a safe place, a place without judgment. To turn her out now, to hand her back to the wolves, would be to break that word. It would be a betrayal not just of her, but of the quiet, simple code he lived by. And Jesse Colt was not a man who broke his word. By the time his small, lonely cabin came into view, he had made his decision. He spurred his horse the last quarter-mile, a terrible urgency gripping him. He had to get to her to warn her. He rounded the last bend and saw the cabin. The front door was open. A chilling, unnatural stillness hung over the homestead. He dismounted before the horse had even come to a full stop, his boots hitting the ground with a thud. He moved silently to the doorway, his hand resting on the butt of his pistol. He peered inside. She was there. She was not in a panic. She was not crying. Her movements were calm, deliberate, and heartbreakingly resigned. She was dressed not in her silk dress, but in one of his own chambray work shirts. It was far too big for her, the sleeves rolled up to her elbows, the hem reaching her knees. On her feet were her own sturdy boots. She had a small bundle on the table, the half-loaf of bread left from breakfast, and a few strips of dried jerky wrapped in a piece of cloth. She was filling his canteen from the water bucket. She was preparing to run. She must have felt his presence because she stopped, her hand frozen on the canteen. She turned slowly, her face pale, but her eyes clear. There was no surprise in them, only a deep, profound sadness. She had known this peace couldn't last. She had been living on borrowed time. She looked at his face, at the grim set of his jaw, and she knew. "You went to town," she said. It wasn't a question. It was a statement of fact, an acknowledgement that the outside world had finally found them. "You saw the posters." He stood in the doorway, a solid, unmoving silhouette against the dying light, the dust of his hard ride still clinging to him. He didn't answer right away. He just looked at her, at the small, pathetic bundle of supplies she had gathered, at the oversized shirt that swallowed her small frame, at the crushing weight of resignation in her eyes. The hunt was on, and the sanctuary was no longer safe. Jesse took a slow step into the cabin and deliberately closed the door behind him. The solid thud of the wood settling into its frame seemed to sever the last tie to the outside world. The dim, warm light of the single lantern on the table enveloped them, creating an intimate, pressurized space. He dropped the sacks of salt and coffee onto the floor. The sound was unnervingly loud in the sudden, heavy silence. He didn't speak, just stood there, his shadow long and dark against the closed door, watching her. May's first instinct was a familiar, sickening lurch of shame. He knew. He had seen the name, the drawing, the accusations. He had seen the price placed on her head. The fragile peace they had built over the last few days felt like a house of cards, and the truth was the gust of wind that had just blown it all down. She could see the condemnation in his eyes, the disgust, the fear. It was all in her imagination, a projection of her own deep-seated guilt, but it felt real. She had brought a plague to his doorstep. "I have to go," she said, her voice tight and strained. She grabbed the small, pathetic bundle of food from the table. "I'm sorry, Jesse. I never should have stopped. I never should have put you in this danger." She tried to move past him, to get to the door, to flee back into the wilderness that would surely kill her, but was at least an honest death. It was better than staying to watch his quiet respect curdle into something ugly. He didn't move. He was a wall of solid, unyielding presence in the small cabin. She stopped a few feet from him, trapped. "Please," she whispered, her composure beginning to fray. "Let me go. They're dangerous men. They'll tear this place apart looking for me. They'll hurt you." "They might," he said, his voice a low, even baritone that cut through her rising panic. "That's their business." "No, it's my business. It's my fault," she insisted, her voice gaining a desperate edge. She gestured wildly, a hand fluttering towards her own face, as if indicating the woman on the poster. "You have to understand. You don't know who I am." This was it, the final necessary act of pushing him away for his own protection. She had to make him see the truth, the ugly version of it that the world would believe. "That poster, it says my name is Maeve Finch. It says I'm a thief. It says I'm a murderer." She spat the last word out like poison, wanting it to shock him, to make him recoil. She needed him to be afraid of her, to be repulsed by her. It would be easier for him to cast her out if he despised her. He took a step forward, closing the distance between them. She flinched back, but his expression wasn't one of disgust or anger. It was something else, something she couldn't read. It was a deep, unwavering stillness. "I saw the name on the poster," he said, his gray eyes holding hers. "And I saw the words they wrote under it. Words written by some rich man 1,000 miles from here. A man who put his hands on you and left bruises." May's breath caught in her throat. He continued, his voice never rising, but each word landing with the weight of a stone. "That's his story. It ain't the one I know." "You don't know any story," she cried, her voice cracking. "I never told you anything." "You told me everything you needed to." He countered, his gaze unwavering. "I know I found a woman half dead in a dust storm, dressed in silk, but with more grit than any rancher's wife I've ever met. I know she was scared to death of her own shadow, but the very next morning she picked up a broom and cleaned my stable, asking for nothing in return. I know she patched my shirt and can sit by a fire for hours without needing to fill the silence with useless talk. That's the woman I know." He took another slow step until he was standing right in front of her. He was so close she could feel the warmth radiating from him, could see the tiny lines etched by the sun around his eyes. "The rest of it," he said, his voice dropping to a near whisper. "The name, the money, the trouble. That's just noise. I don't give a damn about Maeve Finch. I'm not about to abandon May." The name, the simple shortened name she had given him, sounded like a benediction on his lips. The quiet intensity of his words, the simple, unshakable faith he was placing in his own judgment over the loud, violent claims of the world, broke through her defenses. The strength she had clung to for so long, the rigid control she had maintained through years of abuse and a desperate flight, finally crumbled. A single tear escaped and traced a clean path through the grime on her cheek. She didn't make a sound, but her whole body trembled with the force of her unshed grief and her overwhelming gratitude. Jesse saw the tremor run through her. He reached out, not to comfort her in a way she might misinterpret, but to take the bundle of food from her trembling hands. He set it back on the table. The action was one of quiet finality. "You're not going anywhere." He became all business then, the moment of emotional revelation passing as he shifted into the practicalities of survival. Harcourt and his men, they'll be thorough. They'll check every town and settlement first, but they'll start casting a wider net soon. Could be a day, could be a week, but they'll come. And when they do, you can't be here. But where will I go? She asked, her voice small. You're not going anywhere, he said. You're going down. He walked to the center of the cabin to a large, worn bearskin rug that lay before the hearth. He kicked the edge of it aside, revealing the dark-aged planks of the floor. In the center was a recessed iron ring tarnished with age. He bent down, hooked his fingers through it, and with a grunt of effort pulled. A square section of the floor lifted up, revealing a dark, gaping hole, and a steep, narrow ladder leading down into the darkness. A cool, earthy smell, the scent of damp soil and potatoes and time itself drifted up from the opening. What is it? May breathed. Root cellar, he said. Keeps food cool in the summer and stops it from freezing in the winter, but it served other purposes. He lit the lantern from the table and handed it to her. Go on, I'll bring what you need. May hesitated, peering into the blackness. It looked like a grave. Jesse seemed to understand her hesitation. It's safe, he said. My grandfather dug it out by hand more than 50 years ago. Back during the troubles with the army, he hid a Navajo family down there for a month. Man, his wife, 2 kids. Soldiers rode through twice, searched the whole valley. Never found him. This place knows how to keep a secret. That small piece of history changed everything. This wasn't just a hole in the ground. It was a sanctuary consecrated by a past act of courage and defiance. To be hidden here was to be brought into a family legacy, a tradition of protecting the hunted. It was an honor she didn't feel she deserved, but it gave her the strength to move. Holding the lantern high, she carefully descended the ladder. The space below was small, no bigger than the rug above. The walls were hard-packed earth supported by thick wooden beams. It was surprisingly dry. In one corner sat a few burlap sacks of potatoes and onions. Otherwise, it was empty. Jessie came down after her, carrying a stack of blankets, her bundle of food, and a full canteen of water. He spread the blankets in a corner, making a small, comfortable pallet for her. It's not much, he said, his voice echoing slightly in the confined space. It's everything, she replied, her voice thick with emotion. He stood for a moment, looking around the small space, making sure she had everything she needed. His presence seemed to fill the cellar, making it feel less like a tomb and more like a fortress. I'll be up above, he said. I'll check on you when it's safe. But if you hear horses, if you hear voices you don't recognize, you don't make a sound. Not for anything. Understand? She nodded, clutching the blanket. I understand. Good. He looked at her one last time, his gray eyes serious in the lantern light. Then he turned and climbed the ladder. He paused at the top. May, he said. Yes, don't be scared. And then he was gone. The heavy trapdoor settled back into place with a dull, final thud. A moment later, she heard the muffled scrape of the heavy bearskin rug being dragged back over the door, sealing her in. The world above disappeared. She was alone in the cool, silent darkness, the only light the soft golden glow of her lantern. She was a secret buried in the earth. But for the first time in her life, she was not a prisoner. She was being protected. And as she listened to the faint, reassuring sound of Jessie's footsteps moving about the cabin floor above her, she knew that she had finally found a man she could trust. 2 days passed in the cool, earthy darkness. Time in the cellar ceased to be measured by the sun and became a slow, viscous drip of moments marked only by the rhythm of her own breathing and the frantic beating of her heart. The world was reduced to the small circle of gold cast by the lantern, the rough texture of the blankets beneath her fingers, and the muffled sounds from the cabin above. She learned the language of Jesse's movements, the heavy tread of his boots in the morning, the scrape of his chair as he sat for his solitary meals, the soft, almost inaudible sigh he let out before blowing out the main lamp at night. Each sound was a reassurance that he was there, a lone sentinel standing between her and the hunting party. Twice a day, in the deep, starless black of night, he would lift the trap door. He never lit a lantern, and his face was just a shadow in the darkness, his voice a low whisper. He would pass down fresh water and a plate of food, his movements quick and silent. "You all right?" he'd asked the first night. Yes, she had whispered back the word, feeling inadequate. On the second night, he brought something else. He passed down a small, heavy object that felt cold and dense in her hand. It was a pistol, a Smith & Wesson Model 2, small enough to fit in a coat pocket, but deadly nonetheless. "Do you know how to use it?" he'd whispered, his voice urgent. "No," she admitted, her heart beginning to pound. He took her hand in the dark, his calloused fingers guiding hers. "This is the hammer. You pull it back. This is the trigger. You point it at what you want to shoot and you squeeze. Don't jerk it. Just a slow, steady squeeze. It only holds 5 shots. You make them count." He pressed a small handful of loose cartridges into her other palm. "I hope to God you don't have to use it," he had said, his voice rough. "But if they get past me, if they find this cellar, you don't let them take you, May. You hear me?" The unspoken meaning hung in the dark, suffocating air between them. "You don't let them take you alive." She had only been able to knot her throat too tight for words. He had closed the trap door, leaving her alone with the cold, heavy reality of the weapon in her lap. It was on the 3rd day that the world ended. The morning had been like the others, a long stretch of silent waiting. May had been dozing a fitful, dream-haunted sleep when a new sound jolted her awake. It was the sound of horses, but it wasn't the familiar, solitary rhythm of Jesse's buckskin. This was a group, a half-dozen, at least, their hooves churning the dry earth, the sound growing steadily closer. Her blood ran cold. They were here. She heard Jesse's boots hit the floor above her, a single heavy thud. There was no hesitation. She heard the metallic click of his rifle being lifted from its pegs on the wall. She heard him stride to the door. She scrambled to the base of the ladder, pressing her ear against the rough wood of the trapdoor, straining to hear. The horses stopped directly in front of the cabin. There was a jingle of harnesses, the creak of saddle leather, and then a man's voice, smooth and laced with an arrogant authority. "Hello, the house. My name is Harcourt. I'm looking for the owner, Mr. Colt." May heard the cabin door swing open. She pictured Jesse standing there, filling the doorway, his face a mask of stone. "I'm Colt," Jesse's voice rumbled low and steady. "What's your business?" "My business is a fugitive from the law," Harcourt said, his voice closer now. "A woman by the name of Maeve Finch. We have reason to believe she passed through this valley." "Have you seen her?" "I see a lot of things pass through this valley," Jesse replied, his voice flat and non-committal. "Coyotes, dust storms, fools with too many questions." There was a short, sharp laugh from one of the other men, quickly silenced. "I admire a man with a sense of humor," Harcourt said, his tone losing its silken edge and taking on a harder, more menacing quality. "But this is a serious matter. We're agents of the law acting on behalf of Mayor Alistair Finch. This woman is a thief and is wanted in connection with a man's death. There's a $500 reward. It would be a shame if a law-abiding citizen, such as yourself, got in the way of justice. And a reward." The bribe, wrapped in a threat, hung in the air. May held her breath, her knuckles white where she gripped the small pistol. "The only law I recognize on this land is my own," Jesse said, his voice as cold and hard as river stone. "And it says you've got 10 seconds to get your horses turned around and ride out of my valley." "That's a mistake," Mr. Colt, Harcourt said softly. The explosion, when it came, was so loud, so close, it felt like the world was splitting apart. It was the deafening roar of a rifle. May screamed a choked, terrified sound that was swallowed by the cellar's darkness. She heard wood splintering the doorframe of the cabin. Another shot answered immediately. Jesse's Winchester, its deeper boom a defiant reply. Then all hell broke loose. The air above was filled with a barrage of gunfire, the angry crack of pistols and the heavier reports of rifles. Men were shouting, cursing. She heard Jesse's boots pound across the floorboards as he moved away from the doorway, taking cover. A bullet punched through the floor near the far wall, sending a shower of dust and splinters down into the cellar. She scrambled back, pressing herself against the damp earth wall, making herself as small as possible. The fight moved outside. She could hear the sounds receding as Jesse, in a desperate, brilliant move, made a break from the cabin. He was drawing them away, leading the fire toward the corrals and the small rocky outcrop beyond. He was outnumbered 5-1, and he was trying to give her a chance, trying to keep the battle away from her hiding place. The sounds became slightly more muffled now, a chaotic symphony of death playing out under the desert sky. She could distinguish the steady, measured shots of Jesse's rifle from the more frantic, scattered pistol fire of the others. She sat in the dark, trembling, the small, cold pistol clutched in her hands. Every shot was a physical blow. She pictured Jesse out there alone, fighting for her. For a woman whose name he barely knew, a woman who had brought nothing but trouble to his door. The guilt was a suffocating wave, a physical sickness that rose in her throat. He had told her to stay put, to stay silent, no matter what. It was the only instruction he had given her, the only thing he had asked of her. Her survival depended on her obedience. The rhythm of the gunfire changed. Jesse's rifle, which had been firing with a steady, punishing regularity, began to slow. There would be 2 or 3 shots from his attackers, and then a long pause before his single answering shot. May's blood turned to ice. He was conserving ammunition, or he was pinned down, or he was hurt. Then she heard it, a sound that cut through the cacophony of the gunfight. It was a pained, guttural cry, a sound of pure agony. It was Jesse's voice. The triumphant shouts of the other men followed immediately. "He's hit, he's down. Move in," the firing from Jesse's position stopped completely. In that moment, something inside May snapped. The carefully constructed walls of fear and self-preservation that had governed her entire life crumbled to dust. Jesse's instructions, "Stay hidden no matter what you hear," screamed in her mind. But a louder, more powerful voice, the voice of a loyalty she had never known she possessed, screamed back. He was dying. He was out there bleeding in the dust, and he was dying for her. She could stay here in the dark and live. She could obey him and survive and spend the rest of her miserable life knowing that the only good man she had ever met had been killed protecting her. Or she could break her promise. She could face the hunters. She could die with him. It wasn't a choice. It was a certainty. Her hands, slick with sweat, fumbled with the pistol. She pulled back the hammer, the metallic click echoing the final fatalistic click in her own soul. She rose from the pallet of blankets, her movements no longer trembling, but filled with a strange, cold calm. The fear was still there, a living thing in her gut, but it was overshadowed by a ferocious, protective rage. She scrambled up the ladder. The trapdoor was heavy, but she pushed with a strength born of desperation. It lifted, scraping against the floorboards. Sunlight, brilliant and blinding, flooded the cellar. The air that rushed in was thick with the acrid smell of gunpowder. The sounds were deafening now, the shouts of the men close, so close. She pulled herself up and out of the hole onto the floor of the bullet-riddled cabin. The front door hung from one hinge, splintered and broken. Through the opening she could see them. 4 men advancing cautiously in a skirmish line toward the rocky outcrop where Jesse had made his stand. The 5th man, Harcourt, stood back by the horses, directing them, a cruel, satisfied smile on his face. They were closing in for the kill. May didn't hesitate. She ran, stumbling on her weak ankle, out of the shattered doorway and into the yard. "Leave him alone." The voice that ripped from her throat was raw and ragged, a sound she didn't recognize as her own. The 4 men stopped in their tracks, whirling around. Harcourt's head snapped up. Their faces, hardened by cruelty and greed, registered a comical, simultaneous shock. They stared at her as if she were an apparition, a ghost who had just risen from the grave. They saw a woman, small and disheveled, dressed in a man's oversized shirt, her hair a wild tangle around a face pale with terror, but set with a jaw of iron. And they saw the small dark pistol in her hand, held steady in a 2-handed grip, just as Jesse had shown her. For a heartbeat, the world stood still. The gunfight stopped. The desert held its breath. It was her, the $500 prize, standing in the open, not as a victim to be captured, but as a combatant who had just entered the fray. Harcourt's smile vanished, replaced by a look of cold fury. The duel under the desert sky was not over. It had just found a new challenger. The world snapped back into motion with the violence of a breaking dam. Harcourt, his face a mask of incredulous fury, recovered from his shock first. Laughter, sharp and cruel, erupted from his throat. "Well, I'll be," he snarled, a predator enjoying the final foolish struggles of its prey. "The little mouse has teeth. Boys, it seems Mrs. Finch is eager to be reunited with her husband." He raised his own gleaming Colt Peacemaker, but he didn't aim it at May. His target was the rocky outcrop where Jesse lay wounded. "Finish the cowboy," he commanded, his voice ringing with finality. "Then we'll take the lady. Intact if possible. One of the men beside him grinned a flash of yellow teeth in a sun-darkened face and started to raise his rifle. Time seemed to slow to thicken into a heavy, unbreathable syrup. May saw the rifleman's intent, saw Harcourt's pistol leveling for the killing shot. In her mind, a single calm voice, a voice that sounded remarkably like Jesse's, cut through the roaring panic. Point it at what you want to shoot, and you squeeze. Don't jerk it. Her world narrowed to a single tight focus, the dark shape of Harcourt's pistol, the pale hand that held it, and the space between the front sight of her own small weapon and her target. She wasn't thinking about murder or survival. She was thinking only of the man bleeding behind the rocks. She pulled the hammer back, the sound a small, oily click. She took a breath, held it, and squeezed the trigger. The small pistol bucked in her hands, its report a sharp, angry crack that was shockingly loud. The recoil jolted her arm all the way to the shoulder. For a heart-stopping second, she thought she had missed. Then Harcourt let out a choked, furious scream of pain. His pistol flew from his grasp, spinning through the air before clattering uselessly into the dust. He staggered back, clutching his right hand to his chest, his face contorted in a mask of agony and disbelief. A dark flower of blood bloomed between his fingers. The shot changed everything. The hunters who had been advancing with the easy confidence of a pack closing in on a kill froze in their tracks. Their professional arrogance evaporated, replaced by wary uncertainty. The fight had suddenly become unpredictable. Their leader was wounded, and their $500 prize was not a cowering victim, but an armed and dangerously desperate woman. From behind the rocks, Jesse seized the opportunity her desperate act had created. A single shot boomed from his Winchester, not aimed to kill, but to terrify. The bullet kicked up a geyser of dust a foot from the boot of the rifleman who had been aiming at him. The man yelped and jumped back as if bitten by a snake. Jesse was wounded, but he was not out of the fight. That was all it took to break them. These were men motivated by money, not loyalty. The pay for this job wasn't worth dying for, not when faced with a wounded but still deadly cowboy and a woman who had just proven she was willing to shoot. "Fall back!" Harcourt roared through clenched teeth, his face pale with pain and rage. He cradled his mangled hand, his eyes locking on May with a look of pure, murderous hatred. "This ain't over, you hear me? This ain't over." His men needed no further encouragement. Two of them grabbed their wounded leader, half dragging him back toward the horses. The others laid down a covering fire. Their shots, wild and hurried, aimed more at the sky than at any target. They scrambled into their saddles and spurred their horses into a frantic, panicked gallop, disappearing back the way they came, leaving nothing behind but a rising cloud of dust and a profound, ringing silence. For a long moment, May didn't move. She stood frozen in the middle of the yard, the small smoking pistol still clutched in her hands. The sudden quiet was more jarring than the noise of the gunfight. The only sound was the frantic pounding of blood in her ears and the soft whisper of the wind through the bullet-splintered wood of the cabin. The acrid smell of gunpowder hung heavy in the air, a foul perfume of violence. Then the adrenaline that had held her together, that had given her a shooter's calm and a warrior's courage, drained away, leaving her weak and trembling. The pistol felt impossibly heavy. It slipped from her numb fingers and fell with a soft thud into the dust at her feet. Jesse. The name, the thought. The reality of him crashed back into her with the force of a physical blow. Her head snapped up, her eyes scanning the yard, landing on the rocky outcrop that had been his fortress. He wasn't moving. He hadn't fired another shot. He was just gone. Jesse. The name was a torn, ragged cry. She began to run, her weak ankle twisting beneath her, sending a sharp, lancing pain up her leg, but she ignored it. She scrambled across the yard, her feet stumbling on the spent shell casings that littered the ground. The world was a blur of dust and blinding sunlight. Her only focus was the still, silent shape behind the rocks. She found him slumped against the sun-warmed granite of a large boulder. He had slid down into a sitting position, his long legs splayed out in front of him. His rifle lay across his lap, his hands still resting on the stock. His hat had fallen off and lay upside down beside him. His head was lolled to one side and his eyes were closed. His face, underneath a mask of dust and grime, was a waxy, unnatural white. High on his left shoulder, his chambray shirt was soaked through with a dark glistening stain of crimson that was spreading with terrifying speed, dripping from his sleeve to form a small dark puddle in the dust below. The sight of him so still, so broken, shattered the last of her composure. The ferocious rage that had propelled her out of the cabin, the icy calm that had guided her hand, it all dissolved into a wave of pure, undiluted horror. This was her fault. All of it. The bullet holes in his home, the blood in his dust, the life seeping out of him. It was all her doing. She had brought the storm, and he had stood in its path for her. No, she whispered the word, a small broken sound. Oh no, 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 no. She fell to her knees in the dirt beside him, her hands hovering over his body, wanting desperately to help but terrified of touching him, of causing him more pain. Her mind went blank. She knew nothing of wounds, nothing of healing. Her hands were made for pouring tea and holding champagne flutes, not for staunching the flow of a man's lifeblood. "Jesse," she pleaded, her voice trembling. "Jesse, can you hear me?" His eyelids fluttered but did not open. A low groan escaped his lips, a sound of such profound pain, it felt like a knife twisting in her own gut. He was alive. The thought was a small flickering candle in a vast darkness of terror. Tears she had refused to shed for herself now streamed freely down her face, cutting clean tracks through the dust on her cheeks. She reached out a trembling hand and touched his cheek. His skin was cold and clammy. She leaned closer, her world shrinking to this small, desperate space, to this one man. The gunfight, the bounty, her own past, none of it mattered anymore. The only thing that mattered was the shallow, ragged rise and fall of his chest. "Don't die," she begged her words. A choked, desperate prayer whispered into the vast, indifferent silence of the desert. She pressed her forehead against his uninjured shoulder, her tears soaking into the worn fabric of his shirt. Please don't die. She felt a profound, soul-crushing certainty that if he died here in this dusty, lonely place, a vital part of her would die with him. He had shown her a kindness she didn't think existed. He had offered her a trust she had never known. He had given her a reason to believe that a person's worth wasn't written on a poster, but was proven in their actions. He had become her reason to fight, her reason to hope, her reason to stay. "Don't die," she sobbed, her voice breaking completely. "Don't die because of me." The silence that followed her desperate plea was absolute. For a moment, the only thing that existed in the universe was the rasp of Jesse's breathing and the frantic, useless beating of her own heart. Then the instinct for survival, an instinct that had been honed to a razor's edge over the past week, took over. Crying wouldn't save him. Begging the sky wouldn't save him. Only action could. Getting him back to the cabin was a nightmare of grunting effort and searing pain. He was a dead weight, his long, lean body impossibly heavy. She looped his good arm over her shoulders, taking his weight against her own small frame. Her weak ankles screamed in protest, threatening to buckle with every step. She half-dragged, half-carried him across the 50 yards of dusty ground that separated the rocks from the cabin, her breath coming in ragged, sobbing gasps. She fell twice, the two of them collapsing into a tangled heap in the dirt. Both times she forced herself back up, fueled by a ferocious, adrenaline-laced terror. By the time she managed to get him through the shattered doorway and onto his narrow bed, she was drenched in sweat, and his blood, her body trembling with an exhaustion so profound it felt like a sickness. The cabin was a wreck, a testament to the violence that had torn through their quiet world. Splintered holes peppered the walls, letting in thin slivers of the dying afternoon light. The floor was littered with shattered glass from a broken water pitcher and spent shell casings. But May saw none of it. Her world had narrowed to the man on the bed. The wound was high on his shoulder, close to his neck, a ragged, ugly tear in his flesh from which his life was steadily, stubbornly seeping. She knew with a certainty that chilled her to the bone that the bullet was still inside him. Leaving it there would mean a slow, agonizing death from infection if he didn't bleed out first. Her mind, which had been a chaotic storm of panic, became unnervingly clear. A cold, clinical calm descended upon her. She was no doctor, but she had a lifetime of watching, of listening. She had seen farmhands mend animals, had heard old wives' tales of battlefield medicine. She had nothing but the cabin's meager supplies and her own desperate will. It would have to be enough. She built up the fire in the hearth of her movements swift and sure. She put a pot of water on to boil. Then she turned to the most difficult task. She took Jesse's hunting knife from its sheath on his belt. The blade was long and wickedly sharp. Her hands trembled as she held it over the roaring flames of the fire, watching until the steel glowed a dull, angry red. Next, she tore strips from the hem of her own ruined silk dress. The fine, expensive fabric, a relic from a dead life, was now repurposed into crude bandages. The irony was a bitter taste in her mouth. She used a strip of the silk soaked in whiskey from a flask she found in his saddlebag to clean the area around the wound as best she could. He moaned at her touch, a low guttural sound of pure agony that almost broke her resolve. She bit her lip until she tasted blood, and forced herself to continue. Probing for the bullet was the worst part. She had to steel herself to disconnect from the fact that she was cutting into the flesh of the man who had saved her. She took a deep breath, whispered, "I'm so sorry, Jesse," and made the first tentative incision with the point of the sterilized knife. He arched his back, a silent scream, contorting his face even in his unconscious state. Tears streamed down her face, but her hands remained steady. She worked by the flickering light of the lantern, her fingers clumsy and slick with his blood, searching for the small foreign piece of lead that was killing him. After what felt like an eternity, her knife tip grated against something hard. She used the knife and a pair of pliers from his toolbox to grasp the misshapen lump of metal and with a final sickening pull drew it out. The rest of the night passed in a blur of desperate, repetitive tasks. She used the last of the whiskey to cauterize the wound, the smell of searing flesh filling the small cabin, a smell she knew would haunt her for the rest of her life. She packed the wound with clean rags and bound his shoulder tightly with the silk strips, pulling them taut in a desperate attempt to staunch the bleeding. She bathed his face, which was now burning with fever, with cool water. She forced a few sips of water between his cracked lips. She sat in the single wooden chair dragged to his bedside and began her vigil. The desert night grew cold, and the wind whispered through the bullet holes in the walls like the ghosts of the men who had made them. She did not sleep. She watched the slow, agonizing rise and fall of his chest. She listened to his breathing, which was shallow and ragged. She prayed to a God she wasn't sure she believed in anymore, making bargains, offering up her own life in exchange for his. Sometime in the deepest, darkest hour before dawn, his fever spiked. He began to tremble, his body racked with violent shivers. He started to mutter, his voice a hoarse, delirious rasp. He spoke of things she didn't understand, of a cattle drive in a blizzard, of a place called Laredo, of a woman named Sarah. The name hit her like a physical blow. Of course there had been someone else. A man like this, a man of such quiet strength and integrity, would have been loved. Was he calling for a lost wife, a sister, a sweetheart she would never know? She simply held his hand, her own small, blistered fingers wrapped around his large, calloused ones, and whispered meaningless, soothing words until the shaking subsided and he fell back into a restless, uneasy silence. As the first pale fingers of dawn crept through the shattered door, she was still there. Her expensive dress was now nothing more than a blood-stained, tattered rag. Her face was smudged with soot and grime, her eyes burning from lack of sleep. She was hollowed out, an empty vessel filled with nothing but exhaustion and a fragile, flickering hope. The bleeding from his shoulder had slowed to a sluggish ooze. His fever seemed to have broken his skin, now cool and damp to the touch. He was still breathing. It was all she had. She must have dozed off, her body finally surrendering to its own desperate need for rest. Her head slumped forward onto the edge of the mattress, her cheek pressed against the rough wool of his blanket, her hand still tightly clutching his. She fell into a deep, dreamless abyss, a sleep so profound it was like a small death. Jesse woke to a world of muted gray light and a searing white-hot pain in his shoulder. For a moment he didn't know where he was. The last thing he remembered was the crack of a rifle, a stunning, brutal impact that had stolen his breath and sent him spinning into darkness. He blinked, trying to clear the fog from his mind. He was in his own bed. The cabin was wrong. The walls were full of holes. The air was thick with the smell of stale whiskey, gunpowder, and blood. His blood. He tried to sit up, but the movement sent a bolt of agony through him, so intense it made him gasp. The small sound, a sharp intake of breath, was enough. The woman sleeping beside his bed stirred. Her head lifted, and for a second she looked utterly lost, her eyes wide and unfocused. Then her gaze landed on him, on his open, watchful eyes, and the transformation was instantaneous. The exhaustion in her face was washed away by a wave of such profound, overwhelming relief that it was like watching the sun rise. Jesse, she breathed his name, a prayer of thanks. He looked at her, truly looked at her. Her hair was a wild mess. Her face was pale and smudged with dirt, and she was wearing a ruined dress that seemed to be held together by little more than stains and desperation. But her eyes, her deep expressive eyes, were clearer than he had ever seen them. He looked down and saw that her hand was clutching his, her grip fierce, even in sleep. He saw the makeshift bandages on his shoulder, the clean stitched line where she had cut him, the faint lingering smell of cauterization. He understood with a sudden gut-wrenching clarity everything she had done. She hadn't just shot Harcourt. She had fought for him. She had pulled him back from the brink. He saw the discarded pistol on the floor. He saw her face so full of a fierce, protective light. He saw the woman who had trembled on his porch, who had cleaned his stable, who had sat with him in silence by the fire. And he knew with a certainty that went deeper than thought that he had been right to trust her. She leaned forward, of her expression a mixture of hope and terror. "How do you feel?" she asked, her voice a fragile whisper. "Like I got shot." He rasped, his own voice a dry, unused croak. A small, watery smile touched her lips. "You did." The silence returned, but it was a new kind of silence. It was filled with the unspoken events of the long, terrible night. It was filled with the weight of her vigil and the miracle of his survival. The violence had passed, the immediate danger was gone. But in its wake lay the ruins of their quiet sanctuary and the terrifying, unanswered question of what came next. May looked at his face, at the lines of pain etched around his mouth, at the new profound weariness in his eyes. She had saved him, but she was still the woman from the poster. She was still the trouble that had brought this storm down upon him. The danger was gone. But was she still welcome? Had she earned the right to stay in the world she had helped to break? She swallowed the vulnerability of the question, almost choking her. She had to know. "Will you still want me tomorrow?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. The question hung in the quiet, sun-drenched air of the wounded cabin. It was everything. It was a plea for acceptance, a query about the future, a test of the fragile bond that had been forged between them in silence and blood. For a long moment, Jesse just looked at her. He saw the fear in her eyes, the desperate hope, the quiet strength that had held her together through a night of unimaginable horror. He saw the woman who had faced down 5 gunmen for him. Slowly, carefully, he raised his good right hand. The movement was an effort, but he was determined. He brought his hand up and laid his calloused, gentle fingers against her cheek. His thumb stroked away a smudge of dirt. A slow, faint smile, the first she had ever truly seen, touched the corners of his mouth. It transformed his harsh, weathered face, softening the lines, warming the cool gray of his eyes. "Ask me then," he said. "Ask me then" was not a promise, but a possibility. It was a single fragile thread of hope stretched across the chasm of an uncertain future. And for May, it was enough to cling to. The days that followed were a testament to that hope, a slow, painful, and profoundly beautiful unfolding of what tomorrow might actually mean. Jesse's recovery was not a swift or easy thing. It was a brutal inch-by-inch crawl back toward life. For the first week, he was a ghost in his own bed, lost in the gray, murky landscape of fever and pain. His strength had been stolen by the bullet, and he was as helpless as a newborn. May became his anchor to the world. She was his hands, his feet, his memory. Her life narrowed to the 4 walls of the bullet-scarred cabin, and her days found a new, urgent rhythm. She would wake before the sun, her body aching with a weariness so deep it felt embedded in her bones, and her first act was always the same: to lean over him, to place a hand on his chest and to feel for the slow, steady beat of his heart. The reassurance of that simple rhythmic thud was the fuel that got her through the day. She would build up the fire-boil water and begin the grim but necessary task of cleaning and redressing his wound. She learned the geography of his pain, the precise angle at which she could move his shoulder without eliciting a sharp, involuntary gasp. She learned to read the subtle language of his body, the tightening of his jaw that meant the fever was rising, the slight tremor in his good hand that meant he needed water. She spoon-fed him thin broth made from dried jerky and wild onions she found growing near the well, her movements patient and gentle. In the long, silent afternoons while he slept his fitful, healing sleep, she set about repairing their broken world. She used his tools to pry the bullets from the cabin walls, her fingers tracing the violent scars left behind. She found spare planks of wood in the stable and with a clumsy determination patched the larger holes, shutting out the wind that had whispered through them like a mournful ghost. She swept up the shattered glass, repaired the broken door hinge, and scrubbed the dark, ugly bloodstains from the floorboards until her knuckles were raw. Each repaired object, each cleaned surface was an act of defiance. It was her way of telling the world, of telling Harcourt and the distant, shadowy figure of her husband that they had failed. They had not destroyed this place. They had not destroyed its people. Jesse watched her. In his moments of lucidity, his gray eyes would follow her as she moved about the cabin. He saw the dark circles of exhaustion under her eyes. He saw the way she limped on her still sore ankle, never complaining. He saw her small, blistered hands, now surprisingly capable, as she mended his clothes, kneaded dough for biscuits, or polished the action on his rifle. He saw the woman he had found in the storm, the woman who had faced down his attackers, and the woman who was now his tireless, ferocious guardian. He said nothing, for words were a currency he rarely spent, but his silence was no longer one of distance. It was a silence of profound, humbled observation. One afternoon, about a week into his recovery, he was awake when she brought him a bowl of broth. His fever had finally broken for good, and a flicker of his old strength had returned to his eyes. "May," he rasped, his voice still rough. She stopped, her heart giving a little jump. It was the first time he had spoken her name since the gunfight. "Yes." He looked at the bowl in her hands, then at her face. "Thank you," he said. The two words were simple, unadorned, but they held the weight of 100 unspoken emotions. They were an acknowledgement of her fight, her vigil, her unwavering care. They were a recognition of the debt he now owed her, a debt of life itself. Tears pricked May's eyes, but she blinked them back fiercely. "You'd have done the same for me," she said. And it was the truest thing she had ever said. As his body healed, so did the space between them. He began to talk more, not about the past, but about the present, about the land he called home. He taught her the names of the desert plants, the stoic saguaro, the tenacious creosote, the fiery ocotillo. He told her how to read the clouds, to predict the weather. He explained the complex, silent language of his cattle. He was giving her his world, piece by piece, and she accepted each piece as a precious gift. She, in turn, began to shed the skin of her old life. The name Maeve Finch became a distant echo, a ghost story she no longer told herself. Maeve Finch was the woman who wore silk and jewels, who endured a cold, cruel marriage in a stone mansion, who lived in fear. That woman had died in the dust of Jesse Colt's yard the moment she picked up a pistol to defend him. The woman who emerged was just May. She was a woman who knew the weight of a bucket of water, the satisfaction of a well-mended fence, the quiet joy of a shared sunset. She traded her ruined dress for a pair of Jesse's old trousers, which she cut and restitched to fit her, and a soft, worn-out chambray shirt. The simple, practical clothes felt more honest, more her, than any gown she had ever worn. There was no formal declaration, no grand discussion of the future. The threat of Harcourt and her husband still existed, a dark cloud on a distant horizon. But in the small, isolated valley, it felt unreal. Their life together was not built on promises of forever after, but on the solid, undeniable reality of right now. Their commitment was a silent, daily thing. It was in the way he started saving the milder coffee for her in the mornings. It was in the way she learned to anticipate his needs before he voiced them, bringing him a tool before he had to ask. It was in the shared glance across a dinner table, a look that said, "I am here. You are here. That is enough." There was no wedding. There was no proposal. The traditions and contracts of the world she had left behind had no meaning here. What was a spoken vow compared to the act of pulling a man from the brink of death? What was a piece of paper compared to the quiet, unwavering trust they had placed in each other? Their union was forged not before a preacher, but in the crucible of a gunfight. Their vows were not spoken, but lived in every shared meal, every mended shirt, every silent, comfortable evening spent on the porch, watching the stars ignite in the vast velvet darkness of the desert sky. Months passed. The fierce heat of summer gave way to the crisp, cool air of autumn. The bullet holes in the cabin were now just faint, round scars in the wood. Jesse's shoulder healed, leaving behind a puckered, angry scar of its own, a permanent reminder of the day their lives had irrevocably intertwined. He moved with a slight stiffness now, but his strength had returned. May's limp was gone, and her hands were no longer soft and pale, but tanned and calloused. The hands of a woman who was not afraid of work. One evening, as the sun began its slow descent, painting the sky in fiery strokes of orange and purple, they were sitting together on the porch steps. A comfortable silence stretched between them, the kind that no longer needed to be filled. The air was cool and smelled of dust and dry grass. Jesse was whittling a piece of wood, his hands moving with a familiar, practiced grace. May was simply watching the sunset, her heart full of a quiet, profound peace she had never known was possible. She looked at him, at the strong, kind profile of his face softened by the golden light. She saw the lines of hardship and solitude, but she also saw the deep well of integrity and the quiet strength that had been her salvation. He was no longer just the silent cowboy who had rescued her from a storm. He was her partner, her friend, her home. He was the man who had seen her at her most broken and had not turned away. The memory of her own desperate whispered question from that first morning after the fight surfaced in her mind. "Will you still want me tomorrow?" It had been a question born of fear, of a lifetime of conditional affection, of the terror that she was a burden who would eventually be cast aside. He had answered her with a challenge, a gentle deflection. "Ask me then." He had been telling her that tomorrow was an unknown country, that promises were just words, and that the only thing that truly mattered was the present. She reached out and laid her hand on his. He stopped his whittling and turned his hand over his calloused fingers, lacing through hers. His grip was warm and strong and unbelievably real. She looked out at the vast, beautiful, and unforgiving landscape that had almost claimed her, and now felt like the only place on earth she belonged. She looked at the man beside her who had asked for nothing and given her everything. The old question no longer held any fear. It was just a memory, a marker of how far she had come. She leaned her head against his good shoulder, and with a quiet, certain heart, she gave herself the answer. Today, she thought the words a silent, happy vow. Today, I still want you. Thank you for listening to this story. Let us know where you're listening from in the comments below. We'd love to connect and share our thoughts with you. Please subscribe to our channel Wild West Stories 1850 like this video, and consider supporting us further by hitting the hype button to help this story be heard by more people.